All right, welcome everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Backyard Invasives, Identification and Management of Terrestrial Invasive Species. Go ahead and change the slide, Becca. All right, today's speakers are myself. I'm Sean Kittle, the Invasive Species Communications Coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And then we have Becca Bernacki, the Terrestrial Invasive Species Project Coordinator, also with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, which we will refer to as APIP from here on out. Okay, next slide, please. Right, today's trail map is pretty straightforward. We're going to do a little welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about those pesticide credits and a survey that I sent out, and then we're going to jump into an overview and introduction to invasive species. Becca's going to get into management options, and then some species identification and species management, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring that and keeping track of it as Becca is speaking, and we'll make sure we get to your questions at the end. If we miss anybody, then you can jump in and let us know. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and as we've mentioned, you can get pesticide credits for this. 1.5 credits are available for categories 3A, 6A, and 9. To receive the credits, all participants must view the entire webinar, then complete a 10-question evaluation within 2 business days, and we're going to be sending out a link to that, as Becca mentioned, after the webinar. Certificates will be mailed to the address provided, and that's the address you provide, not we provide. And then a link to the quiz will be provided at the end of this training. And we'll put that in the chat, and I'll also send it out in an email to make sure everybody has it. All right. And you should have received, if you registered in the last day or so, you may not have received the pre-webinar survey, but I did send a pre-webinar survey out on Monday afternoon, I believe. And really, we're just trying to better understand participants' knowledge, awareness, and attitudes toward terrestrial invasive species, prevention and management as they go into the webinar. And there will be another follow-up survey afterwards to kind of see how we did. So we're really trying to understand what your knowledge is of invasive species. Hopefully we've taught you something throughout this webinar, and we're trying to make our educational resources more effective. So we're gathering these questions, hoping you can take 5 minutes to answer them for us, and that'll inform how we do these webinars and other things moving forward. So we really appreciate it if you could take the time to do those. Okay, next up. All right, you can skip right through this slide. All right, so what is the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, also known as APIP? APIP is one of 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management, also known as a PRISM, P-R-I-S-M, across New York State. Our service area is the Adirondack Park and north to the Canadian border. You can see the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake Ontario one kind of comes up along that Canadian border as well. Our program is funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, which is administered by the DEC. And we are housed in the Nature Conservancy's Keene Valley office, which is right here in the Adirondacks. APIP's mission is to work in partnership to minimize the impact of invasive species on the Adirondack region's communities, lands, and waters. Since invasive species are primarily spread by human activity, our outreach efforts largely revolve around public education and prevention. It's a lot easier to prevent invasive species from spreading than it is to deal with them once we're here, and you'll hear a lot more about that throughout this webinar. We also empower landowners through trainings like this one, where we teach people to identify invasive species and to do their own management of the invasives that might be on their property. And out in the field, our team focuses on managing existing priority infestations to mitigate their negative impacts. You're going to hear about some of those negative impacts in a bit too. We're able to work on land, and we're also able to work in aquatic spaces where we manage aquatic and terrestrial invasive plants and animals. All right, next slide, please. So invasive species, in order for a species to be invasive, it needs to check 2 boxes. It needs to not be native to the region in question. It's, as I mentioned, it's often moved there by humans, and it must cause harm to the environment, economy, or public health. So if you look to the right here, we have poison ivy. I don't think anybody likes poison ivy. It definitely causes harm to public health. If you've ever gotten into it, you know what I'm talking about. But it's native to the region, so it's not invasive, even though most people don't like it. Next up is the tomato. Tomatoes are delicious. People like them, but they are not native to the United States. But they also don't cause any harm to the environment, economy, or public health. So even though they're not native, they are not considered to be invasive. And then lastly, we have swallowwort. So swallowwort, it's a really cool looking flower. It's a part of the milkweed family. Butterflies don't know the difference. And swallowwort has chemicals that are actually harmful to the monarch caterpillars. So this is something that's not native, and it's also something that causes harm to the environment. Therefore, swallowwort is considered an invasive species. Next slide, please. So let's dig into that idea of what makes a species invasive a little bit more. And these are some common traits of invasive species. So invasive species, now they don't have to have all of these. A species does not have to have all these traits, but oftentimes they do have one or more of them. So the first one here is they lack predators and parasites. So in the lower right-hand corner, the red berry there, that's called Japanese barberry. Japanese barberry is a poor forage for animals in our area, and it has these really nasty thorns that keep animals at bay. Like larger animals especially do not like to go near it. So mice love to hide under Japanese barberry because it protects them from things that want to eat them. More mice means more ticks and more Lyme disease. So Japanese barberry, the plant itself lacks predators and parasites. Nothing really wants to go near it, but it also has a secondary human health concern of the mice being able to hide under it and spread ticks more easily. So next we have produce many offspring and or seeds. In the top left there, purple loosestrife. You can see all those seeds underneath it on that paper there. Purple loosestrife, one plant can produce millions of seeds, just one plant. Next, we have produced by multiple means. So right next to that, the yellow flower there is yellow iris, and that can reproduce by producing seeds or through these incredibly fast-growing rhizomes. Generalists. So a generalist is exactly how it sounds. It can handle a wide range of light, soil, moisture, and temperature conditions. The lower left there, that sort of tropical looking plant there, we have a tree of heaven, and that's an amazing generalist. It can handle a lot of different conditions, and it's also a host species of spotted lanternfly, which has not yet been confirmed in our region, but I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a concern just about everywhere else. So this one's kind of a 1-2, this thing can grow just about anywhere, but spotted lanternfly also likes it. And then lastly, we have monopolized resources. Once established, invasive species can form a monoculture, which basically means that they're going to hog all of the resources for themselves and make it very difficult for native species to coexist with them. All right, next slide, please. So here's some, my top slide did not show up. Here are some negative, there it is. Here are some negative impacts on the environment, public health, or the economy. So let's start with the top right. That is garlic mustard. That is a good example of how something could just spread and take over the understory, right? Garlic mustard has chemicals that prevent other plants from growing around them. It actually will kill the soil fungus that the trees need, and it forms this monoculture, which means that native biodiversity is going to be lost. And public health, lower left-hand corner, that's from either wild parsnip or giant hogweed. These plants can produce really nasty chemical burns, which are photovalic. Is that the correct term, Becca? Photovalic?
Phytotoxic.
That's it. Thank you. That
Phototoxic.
means, yeah, so you get it on your skin, and then if you go out into the sun, it basically causes it to do that. It causes it to react, and you get these nasty rashes. And then lastly, in the lower right-hand corner, we have Japanese knotweed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Japanese knotweed in a minute here. But Japanese knotweed can completely take over roadsides, consuming signs and guardrails and rights-of-way. It's a huge problem for transportation professionals who must spend a lot of time and money just keeping it at bay. And you can see a picture there of Japanese knotweed on a roadside, how it's completely consumed that guardrail. And there might be a sign in there too. We can't tell. All right, next slide, please. So lastly, I just want to kind of break out an invasive species and sort of go over these concepts really quick. We're going to talk about knotweed species, and that is a big patch of knotweed there. So knotweed ID, what you're going to see is a hollow bamboo-like stems. I've heard people call it Adirondack bamboo. The stems also have a zigzagging shape to them. You can see that really well in that top picture. They have large heart-shaped leaves, and the leaves alternate along the stem, which means they don't grow next to each other. They are staggered. The dormant reddish-brown stems are visible in winter. You've probably seen large stands of it in your travels, and you'll see these clusters of tiny white flowers that bloom in August. All right, next slide, please. All right, habitat. Knotweed species are generalists. They can be found growing along forest edges and stream banks, as well as in disturbed and open areas such as roadways. So here you have a sandy pile that was part of an excavation site, and you can see the knotweed is absolutely loving it. And one of the problems is if any of this fill gets transported from this site to another site, and there's just a little piece of Japanese knotweed in there, it's probably going to take root wherever it ends up, and you're going to have another patch like this one. So it's really good at reproducing. All right, next slide, please. Distribution is pretty much everywhere. As you can see on this map, it's located in most of the US and Canada at this point. And keep in mind, these are confirmed reports of where it exists. So it could be in some of those other states now or provinces. Knotweed is believed to have been introduced to the US in the late 1800s for use as an ornamental plant. And since then, it's been reported and confirmed in all of these places that are in green here on the map. Okay, next slide. And knotweed impact. So this thing spreads really rapidly and it has a shallow root system that destabilizes stream banks. And this is also one of those 1-2 kinds of things. So you've got the shallow root system that's going to destabilize the stream bank soils. That also makes it more susceptible to erosion, which helps the plant spread. So if you get a spring flood, and there's a big patch of knotweed there, those waters can easily knock out a bunch of that knotweed, carry it downstream where it takes root and forms a brand new stand of knotweed. These dense stands also make it difficult to access waterways. So if you look in the top left picture there, you'll see knotweed growing along a stream. If you're looking to come to the region to go fly fishing or something like that, you're going to have a really tough time getting through that stand. Knotweed can also grow in cracks in building foundations and sidewalks, which creates a problem down the road. And the stands also block native species from growing. So if you take a look at that lower right-hand picture, that's actually a look at the understory of a knotweed stand. And you can see a couple leaves in there, but you don't see anything growing under there. It's dense, it's dark, it's thick. It's going to really outcompete native species and block them from taking root there, which is a huge problem for biodiversity. All right, next slide, please. All right, now we're on to Becca. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks for that great introduction, Sean. And
Sure
as
thing.
a review for you folks, taking the pesticide quiz, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, what are the 2 things that we need to be an invasive species? They need to be non-native and they need to cause harm to the economy, the environment, or human health. So before we jump in and really talk about some of these species in more detail and their species-specific management, I want to start back at the beginning and really talk about what some of our management options are so that you understand what I'm talking about as we get into it a bit more. Now, I'd be remiss to talk about invasive species management and not talk about integrated pest management. Now I'm going to read right from the slide, and integrated pest management is an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management that relies on a combination of common sense practices. And really what that boils down to is those last 3 words, common sense practices. We want to do what makes sense to us. So we'll talk through the cycle and what it all means. So the first thing you're going to do is scout. You're going to go out and see something, scout your area and see if you find any invasive species. So are you seeing something that's creating a monoculture where nothing else is growing? Are you seeing something new there? Then you're going to come back and try to figure out what that is. And you want to be able to correctly identify that invasive plant. We want to make sure it's not a lookalike. And we also want to research its biology because depending on the management approach that you undertake, there's often best times to do those management approaches. Again, we want to do the management at the time that makes the most sense to do it, and we're going to have the most damage to the plant. Then we're going to do an assessment of all of our management options. So do I only have a few plants? Maybe mechanical management's our best option. Or maybe I have a really, really dense infestation of some wild parsnip that can burn me if I try to manage it mechanically. Maybe I want to take a chemical approach there. Then we're going to go ahead and implement that best management practice that we've chosen. We want to do that at the optimal time of year, and we know that because we've done our research and under the appropriate conditions. And finally, and most importantly, we want to evaluate. So we're going to come back in a few weeks or the next season and see if it worked. Maybe it worked really well, and we want to go with a less impactful management the next year. Maybe we did a chemical control and now there's only a few plants left, so we can mechanically manage them. Maybe we tried a chemical treatment and it didn't really work too well, so we need to change the mode of action of the herbicide that we're using to have better control next year. Part of an IPM strategy is also establishing a management goal. So say I have a big patch of honeysuckle, which is an invasive shrub growing in my hedgerow. I have a lot of choices. I can choose to do nothing and just accept that it's there. Maybe that hedgerow kind of comes out into a field where I'm growing something, and I don't want it expanding into my field. I could do some suppression or localized control where I only manage it where it's invading my field, but let it continue to spread along the hedgerow. I can decide to do containment, where I don't let it spread any more than it has. So we're going to try to contain it where it is. Or I can try to do an eradication and remove all the invasive plants as well as the seeds in the seed bank from the area. So for every place where we undertake invasive species action, we want to have a site management plan. We want to be realistic about our goals and have well-defined outcomes. So we have a plan going forward each year. So the first thing we ask ourselves is who. So what species will be the target for management? Maybe you have multiple species in an area. Maybe you want to target one and not the other. Or maybe you want to target both. Next is what. What management techniques will you use? We use mechanical, chemical, biological, a combination. Next is when. When is the target species most vulnerable? And something we also want to consider is when does that species set seed? Because we don't want to spread those seeds around while we're conducting our management. And finally, where. Where will that management take place and at what scale? And to help us visualize that last part more, I have this slide. So we have green blob plant here, which is an invasive species. I made it up today. It's invasive green blob plant. And we have our core infestation where it's really, really dense. And we have these circles kind of going out as it gets less and less dense. So this can be any scale. This can be the entire Adirondack Park. And this is kind of how I plan my management. Or it could be just an invasive species infestation in your backyard. Sean, do you mind admitting a few folks that are in the waiting room? Sorry about that, folks. So the core infestation is probably going to be our lowest priority. That's where it's going to be densest, and that's where it's going to be hardest to manage. However, we can have plants that are further away, and those represent a source for those seeds getting even further. So those are going to be our highest priority in those less dense areas to manage first. So we've talked a lot about planning our management, but what are our tools in our toolbox? I'm going to talk about 3 tools today. I'm going to talk about prevention, manual control, which is really using our muscles essentially to manage these invasive species, chemical control, and today we're going to talk about foliar sprays, stem injections, and cut stump treatments. There are other chemical options that we won't go into today, but we'll cover those. I'm going to touch very, very briefly on a biological control for one of the species we're covering today. And I will note that there are also cultural controls, which can include burning or grazing of invasive species. What's really, really important to note here is that no matter what method you undertake, all methods will require multiple years of treatment. Invasive species management is never a one and done. You're always going to go back year after year and monitor that site and manage any reemerging species. So the first management option, I say management and funny there because this is kind of what we do before an invasive species gets there, is prevention. And prevention is always going to be our most cost-effective management method. So I thank all you folks for joining us today to learn about invasive species, because once you learn to identify these species, we can learn to prevent them. It's the old, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here. So as I mentioned, the first step in prevention is learning to identify species. So maybe you're out on a hike and you pull over on the shoulder of the road and you get out in the ditch and there's some purple loosestrife going there. Now you know that that's purple loosestrife. You know that's an invasive species and you don't want to transport it further down the trail or back to your home. So you want to prevent that species and you know to clean your boots. We also don't want to purchase invasive plants. So in New York State, we have both regulated and prohibited species. Prohibited invasive species are not available for sale in New York. Regulated species, however, are available for sale in New York, and they should be properly labeled at the nursery or greenhouse you're purchasing them from. There are also invasive species that aren't on that list, and I encourage you to check out your local PRISM's website to learn all the invasive species in your region. By not purchasing invasive species, we're not bringing those seed sources into our yards and creating spread vectors that way. Next, Say we're managing an invasive species on one portion of our property. We want to make sure to clean those tools before we bring them to another area of our property. Some of these seeds and propagules can be really, really tiny. So if we clean that equipment in the area of the infestation, we reduce the chance of spreading it to a new area. And that does include like the soles of your boots. That's kind of one thing that's often forgot when we're doing this management. If you are doing a construction project, I encourage you to investigate clean fill for those projects. APIP also just put out a fact sheet. Maybe Sean can drop the link in chat here for our best management practices for construction and fill projects. And last but not least, a lot of invasive plants have been sold over the years in the ornamental trade. So if you do have these invasive plants in your garden, we do encourage you to replace them with natives. The next tool in our toolbox here is manual control. One form of manual control is digging or pulling. When we dig or pull the plant, we want to remove the entire root system. We can do that using a digging tool like a shovel, as you can see on the right, or a leverage tool. We have a picture of a weed wrench there on the left, and that's just a mechanical advantage. It clamps onto the base of an invasive shrub or tree and gives you that leverage to help you pull out the root system. Once you've dug out that entire root system, you want to tamp down the soil to limit disturbance. Debris from your plants, especially if you have woody plants, can be chipped or mulched or burned if allowed under your local ordinance. You want to make sure if you're doing that, you're not chipping or mulching a species that spreads via fragmentation. That goes back to our IPM and learning about the biology of the species. And oftentimes these plants can also be left in bush piles, but we want to make sure those roots are not in contact with the ground so that they're not able to reestablish themselves. Another mechanical option is cutting or mowing. So a lot of plants can be managed with cutting or mowing, and we can do this by cutting or mowing the plant at ground level, either manually with our loppers, as you can see in the picture, or with motorized equipment such as a weed whacker or a lawnmower. However, we want to be really, really careful to do this before seed production. If we mow something when it's in seed, what does a lawnmower do? It kind of flails around all the grass you cut, right? So if you do that, you're flailing around all those seeds and you're making a bigger problem for yourself. You can also get those seeds in the tires of your mower and spread them in new areas. So if you do mechanical treatment or mowing treatment, we want to do that before seed set. Again, if you're cutting or mowing more woody material, that can be chipped or mulched, can be left in bush piles. What's really, really important here is do your research, because some species do respond to cutting via root suckers or other forms of sprouting. So we want to be aware of that and maybe then move to a cut stump treatment in combination with this. Chemical control. So the three types we're going to talk about today are foliar spray, where we use a diluted solution of herbicide applied to the foliage or leaves of the plant. A cut stump, which I just alluded to, which is where we cut off a plant and then we use a small amount of concentrated herbicide on that cut stump. Or stem injection, where we're also going to use a small amount of concentrated herbicide, but this time we're going to inject it directly into the hollow stem of the plant. What I will note is that there are other methods of chemical control, such as basal bark applications and hack and squirts. We're not going to discuss those today, but I don't want you to think that there are just these three options for chemical management. So a quick note on the use of herbicides. First, sometimes herbicides are our best option. Maybe we have a really dense infestation of something. Excuse me, folks. Sorry about that. I had a tickle in my throat. Sometimes herbicides are our best option. So maybe we have a really dense infestation or something. Last Friday, I actually gave a talk to some DOT folks, and we talked about IPM and why sometimes herbicides are our best option. It may be that that species has a sap that can harm us and we don't want to mechanically manage it and chance getting that sap on us. Or it could be a species that spreads via fragmentation and we don't want to risk breaking that species up with mechanical management. Also really important is we only want to use herbicides when and where their use will enhance the natural integrity of the system that they're applied. So we don't want to go do a big spray when we only have a few plants around. We want to really target what we're doing and do what's best for the environment in that situation. We want to apply all herbicides in the most targeted and selective means possible, using the least toxic and the lowest amount of product. So this talk is really targeted towards landowners, but when I talked to DOT on Friday, we talked about maybe sometimes getting out and using backpack sprayers instead of using boom sprayers on trucks when we only have a smattering of plants after we've managed it for a few years, or if it's a new infestation. Some best management practices. Really, really important here, folks, is to know your limit. So I know if there are folks on here today that are certified applicators who are here for our credits. Only those folks, only certified applicators can apply herbicides on property that they do not own. You as a landowner in New York State can apply herbicides on your property. But if you're out and you're spraying some knotweed on your property line and neighbor Bob comes over and says, hey, Jim, can you come spray that patch on my side too? You can't. You can explain to Bob how he can do it on his own property, but you cannot go over to his property and manage it. Always, always, always please wear your proper PPE. It's listed on the product label, and the label is the law in New York. You want to do everything that you can to protect yourself. We also always want to be mindful of environmental conditions. So things like rain and dew can affect how well that herbicide is going to stick to the leaves and work. So we want to be mindful of that. Wind can affect our droplet size, or wind can affect how far our droplets go on our sprayers. So we want to be mindful of wind and choose an appropriate droplet size so we don't have a lot of overspray. In New York State, we want to be careful, and anywhere, I guess, we want to be careful not to apply near water. If you are a landowner and you are using chemicals near water, please hire a certified chemical applicator or pesticide applicator. There are special products that need to be used by water. We always want to choose an appropriate product and application method for both your target species and settings. So that kind of gets back to what I was saying about water. Many species can be effectively controlled by glyphosate, triclopyr, or imazapyr-based herbicides, but you want to check that product label. You also want to check that product label for the proper dilution rate, so you know the best rate of that product to have an impact on the plant. And finally, be patient. A lot of the products we're talking about today are systemic herbicides. Systemic herbicides are going to be absorbed through the plant tissue and translocated down to the roots. So it's not going to have an instant contact kill. It's going to take sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, especially in the cooler weather as we get into fall, for you to see that visible decline. Be patient, know that it's working, and don't go retreat those plants. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a second. So on the left, we have glyphosate-based and imazapyr-based. Those are the chemical components of those herbicides. And here are some trade names if you want to go purchase these products. I'm not endorsing any of these products. I'm just giving you some background information here. I do have some online herbicide retailers listed, but a lot of these products can also be found at your local Lowe's or Tractor Supply or like store. This slide will be shared after for your reference, so don't worry about writing things down. Now we'll kind of jump into how we conduct these chemical treatments. So the first is a foliar spray. We're going to read that label and see what our manufacturer's label recommendation is for a rate. And we're going to mix the herbicide according to that rate. Then we're going to use our backpack sprayer, handheld sprayer, those 1 gallon sprayers you can buy at the hardware store, and carefully apply the herbicide solution to the leaf surface. And we want to make sure that leaf is wet, but that it's not wet to the point of runoff. How are we going to mix that? I already said it. You're going to hear me sound like a broken record today. The label is the law in New York State, so read the label. Make sure you know how you're diluting it. Make sure you know what your proper PPE is. You want to have a spill kit or absorbent available. Most spills that happen are going to happen during mixing, so be aware of that. Also use your recommended PPE. I just mentioned most spills and accidents happen when we're mixing, so we want to wear that PPE not just when we're using the herbicide, but when we're mixing it as well. Next, you want to determine how much pesticide solution you need. So if you only have a few plants, you probably don't want to fill this whole backpack sprayer. We don't want excess herbicide sitting around in our backpack sprayers. The potency of those products decreases over time. And we also don't want that excess just sitting in our garage. It's better to have that in that concentrated jug to mix up later. When you're mixing, you're going to want to try to distance yourself from sensitive resources. So usually I try to mix on a driveway or somewhere kind of impervious surface, kind of away from plants in case I do have that spill. So to mix 1 gallon of solution, we want to remember to make our pesticide sandwich. So for 1 gallon of water, we're going to add half a gallon of water. Then we're going to add our herbicide, our surfactants, or any additives that we're adding, and then adding our remaining water up to that 1 gallon mark. Some helpful tips, as I mentioned, we want to avoid mixing mixing excess herbicide solution. Man, that was a little bit of a tongue twister that I wasn't expecting. We want to adjust our sprayer nozzle to achieve an appropriate droplet size. So that's going to depend on, you know, the wind speed and that sort of thing. We don't want to have a lot of cast off. We want the herbicide to hit our target plant and not go elsewhere. We want to work from the inside of our infestation out. So that helps us avoid walking through treated areas and getting that herbicide product on us. As an additive, you can also use an indicator dye, and that indicator dye, a lot of times they're blue, and then you can tell where you've treated so that you can track not only what you've treated in your progress, but you can also make sure that you're not walking through those treated areas and limiting your exposure to yourself. Finally, you want to figure out what the optimum treatment time is for that species. And for many species, it's going to be during peak flower. After peak flower, a lot of times plants are absorbing those nutrients back down into their roots, and it's a great time to help translocate those solutions. To do a cut stump treatment, we're going to cut our plants as close as possible to ground level. We're going to mix our herbicide following the manufacturer's labeled recommendations, and then we're going to use either a commercial grade spray bottle with an adjustable nozzle or a paintbrush to cover that cut stump with that herbicide solution, as you can see in the pictures here. Again, before you mix your herbicide, read the label, know what the appropriate rate is, make sure that your product is labeled for the plant that you're trying to treat. Always have your spill kit or absorbent ready in case you do have those spills. The gentleman here is doing a great job of displaying proper PPE. So you can see he has his gloves on, he has long pants and long shirt on, he has eye protection on, so he's ready in case something happens to protect himself. Again, you want to determine how much is needed, so you're only mixing the appropriate amount. Remember, it's better to have to mix two small amounts than have a whole bunch of extra sitting around. And you can see here he's distanced himself from sensitive resources, so he's mixing in a tote, so in case he spills, it's in that tote and easy to clean up, it's not in the environment. And in addition to that, he is on a gravel pad, so he's kind of doing double duty here, which is always great. Again, we're going to make that pesticide sandwich, so we're going to add half our amount of water, our herbicide, our dyes, our surfactants, and then our remaining water. Helpful tips, very similar here. Avoid mixing or excess solution. You can use an indicator dye to track your progress. I also sometimes use pin flags here, so I'll cut 10 or so stumps, put a pin flag down next to each one of those plants that I've cut, and then I'll go immediately treat those areas, and I'll keep on that progress. You do want to treat as soon as possible after cutting, so you don't want to do an hour or two of cutting and then go back through. It's best to treat those as soon as possible. Again, you want to work from the inside of your infestation out, so you avoid walking through treated areas. And oftentimes the best time to control these species is going to be spring or fall, but again, research your species, research its biology, and research your product. The last type of chemical control we're going to talk about today is stem injections. So the first thing we're going to do is calibrate our injector to the optimal dose. A lot of times I use water to do this. Then we're going to fill our herbicide reservoir. Many stem injections actually use 100% concentration of that product, but always consult your pesticide label and make sure that dilution isn't warranted. If it is, you want to make that pesticide sandwich the same way we just talked about. Then you're going to align your needle with the plant, insert the needle, and slowly and fully depress the plunger. You've calibrated that injector to inject a certain amount, so we want to make sure we get that full injection. So we want to make sure we fully inject that plant. Then we're going to mark the treated plant above the injection site so that we know that we've treated it. We do that above the injection site because sometimes a little bit of that herbicide will dribble out and it can obscure our mark if we do it below the site. Helpful tips, again, only put as much herbicide in your reservoir as you think you're going to need for that. So if you only have a few cans of knotweed to inject, you don't want to fill that entire reservoir. Fill your reservoir over a catch basin, as you can see. I actually believe this is my colleague Zach doing in this picture here. He's also wearing his proper PPE. We can mark our treated plants to track our progress. As always, we're going to work from the inside of an infestation out. And usually the optimum treatment time is going to be during peak flower, but again, research your specific plant. Chemical control cleanup, we want to use up all of the herbicide in our sprayer. The best way to clean our our equipment is to use a tank sprayer, but if you don't have that, what you can do is fill the sprayer container about half full of water, agitate it, pour that out on an impervious surface, not near water surfaces where it can evaporate, and do that 2 or 3 more times to really clean that equipment. So now that we know kind of the lingo for mechanical and chemical treatment, let's talk about some species and the best way to manage them. The first species we're going to talk about today is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a biennial herb. It can grow up to 4 feet tall in its second year. It thrives in deciduous forests and partially shaded moist habitats. So I was actually out in Burlington earlier this week with some of our seasonal staff picking up their pickup trucks for the season. And one of our trucks was late, so we ended up sitting in the parking lot waiting for a bit. And I was talking with our steward, who manages thousands of garlic mustard plants. And we looked up into this little hillside next to the parking lot in the deciduous forests, and what do you know? Highly disturbed area in the middle of the city, lots and lots of garlic mustard growing. The leaves on this plant do differ between that first year and that second year of this biennial plant. So in the first year, the leaves are going to be this rosette that you can see on the left-hand side of kidney-shaped leaves. And in the second year, the plants can grow on multiple stems I cannot talk this morning, multiple tall stems, and they're going to have these triangular, sharply toothed leaves. If you're ever in doubt, you can crush up some garlic mustard leaves, and they're going to smell like very pungent garlic when you crush them up. The fruit and flowers. So garlic mustard has these 4 petaled white flowers that are present in late spring. They are present right now throughout the Adirondacks. Ryan can probably nod his head here, but you may be even past peak flower down there in Lower Hudson region at this point. Plants are going to produce a multitude of seeds, which senesce in midsummer, and these seeds can remain viable in the soil for up to 7 years. So remember, I said invasive species management is never one and done. These seeds are going to be in the seed bank, and we're going to have to go back year after year and manage this invasive species. Garlic mustard's native range is in Europe. So this is just some occurrence points. You'll see these for each species that people have plotted, but you can see in this map how dense those occurrences are in Europe. And the impact. So it grows in early spring. I think we all had a really heavy frost here in the Adirondacks just last week. It's really not quite feeling just like spring just yet, but the species is already out. It's already in flower, and that early growth really allows it to outcompete our native species, and that lowers our diversity. Sean also talked about how this plant can release chemicals that are harmful to the soil fungus that are really important to our native trees. And remember, part of our IPM that I talked about is making sure that we have the appropriate species, and they're often lookalikes. So here are some lookalikes for garlic mustard. The first is violet. Those violet leaves look very, very similar to first year garlic mustard leaves. I do this every year, and sometimes those violet leaves still trip me up. They are going to have slightly shallower teeth on them, and they are going to have a more pointed tip. But oftentimes what I do when I'm in doubt, I rip one of those leaves up and I crush it up and I smell it and see if it smells like garlic. So you can kind of see that garlic mustard in the center and the slight differences with the violet. Creeping Charlie is a vine, and it does look, the leaves do again look very similar to those first year plants. It is going to have more rounded edges. They are also going to lack those deep veins that you can see on the garlic mustard in the center there. Creeping Charlie is also a non-native plant. So garlic mustard management. Garlic mustard responds really, really well to being hand pulled or dug. I'm sure we've probably all heard of garlic mustard pulls advertised in our area. I've participated in quite a few before I got this job. You're going to pull out the plant, remove the entire root system. You're going to take that plant material and then put it in a contractor bag. Leave it in the sun for 2 or 3 weeks until it either gets really brittle or really soupy, and then you can just dispose of it in your native trash system. So you can put it out in the curb, you can take it to the landfill. For all these species today, I'm going to talk about chemical controls. I've said it before, I'll say it again, the label is the law in New York State. So these are just some generalizations of what we generally see for products. Most glyphosate products recommend being diluted to a 2% rate, volume to volume rate. And most triclopyr products are about 1.25 to 2.5. Again, check the product label that you're using. These are generalizations to just give you an idea. The next species that we're going to talk about today is purple loosestrife. This is an erect herbaceous perennial plant. It can grow from about 3 to 7 feet tall. It can grow in a variety of wet habitats, including wet meadows, marshes, riverbanks, edges of ponds and reservoirs. And it's a very, very, very common roadside invasive species that we see in ditches. Its leaves are going to either be directly opposite from each other or in these whorls of 3. So you can see how those 3 leaves are kind of directly across from each other. The leaves are going to be lance-shaped. The edges are going to be smooth and not have any teeth on them. Sometimes the leaves will clasp the stem, as you can kind of see happening here. And the leaf veins do not go all the way to the leaf edge, which is important when we talk about identifying some lookalikes or differentiating from some lookalikes. The stem of purple loosestrife is pretty unique. It's angular, square-shaped. So if I take that stem and roll it in my fingers, it's not going to roll like a pencil. It kind of chunks along. The small stems may shoot out from the main stem above the mature leaves. And what's really interesting here is previous year stems do persist throughout the winter into the following growing season. So on the right, you can see that picture. It's clearly the winter. We have some snow on the ground, and that purple loosestrife is still hanging out. And you can see all of those seeds still on that plant. The flower, what purple loosestrife is best known for, has these showy magenta flowers. They're pretty easily identifiable from about July to September up here in the Adirondacks. If you're in different parts of the state, it's probably going to be a little bit earlier. Each one of those flowers is going to have 5 to 7 petals, and the flowers are going to grow in flower spikes. The species is really spread via seed. So Ryan put some great information in chat about garlic mustard and how we don't want to manage that species when it's in seed. The same is true of purple loosestrife. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge for those of you taking the quiz. A single purple loosestrife plant can produce up to 2.7 million seeds. These seeds are very tiny, and as you can imagine, for one plant to make so many of them. And just like garlic mustard, they can remain dormant in the soil for several years. Native range of this species, again, Europe and Asia, as you can kind of see on this occurrence map. And the impact, so the species grows really fast, and in addition, it has a really high reproductive potential. If you have 1.1 plant, you could have up to 2.7 million plants the next year if all those seeds were to germinate. So you can just picture how exponentially fast an infestation can get out of control. Its fast growth with that high reproductive output allows it to outcompete our native species and lower the diversity of these sites. It is a wetland species, and it can alter the hydrology of nutrient cycling within wetlands. Lookalikes. The most common lookalike I'm going to see, and you're going to see, is going to be fireweed. It has very similar flower color on those spikes. The big difference here is fireweed only has 4 petals, where purple loosestrife is going to have 5 to 7. Fireweed also grows in drier areas. Sometimes I'll have folks send me a picture of a plant and ask me what it is, and I'll have to ask them to go back out and send me a more close-up picture of the petals just so I can count the petals, because I can't see where that plant is growing. The leaves may be slightly different. They may have lightly toothed leaves as opposed to those smooth leaves of the purple loosestrife. Blue vervain is another native lookalike. The flowers are going to be a lot smaller and blue, however, but they do grow in those flower spikes. The leaves here are going to be toothed. However, blue vervain does grow in moist areas very similar to purple loosestrife, and unlike the fireweed, which prefers drier areas. To manage purple loosestrife, digging or pulling really great options for small infestations. As always, we want to make sure to get that entire root system, take that plant material, put it in a bag, solarize it, let it either get crispy or soggy, and then get rid of it in your native trash system. We can cut or mow this species, so we're going to cut it to ground level prior to flowering. We may need to cut it multiple times before that time of year. For all the reasons we've talked about earlier, we never want to mow this species when it's in seed, or any species when it's in seed. And if possible, rake that plant material up, solarize it, and just give yourself a better chance of not spreading any seeds. Again, broken record here, the label is the law in New York State. They made fun of me on Friday when I talked to the DOT folks for saying that a million times. These herbicide rates are just recommendations based on what we normally see. Always check your label. we can use a foliar spray of a glyphosate-based product at a 1.5% volume to volume ratio, or a triclosan-based product, usually at about a 2% concentration. And remember, I mentioned we're going to touch very, very briefly on one biocontrol today, and we'll talk about biocontrols for purple loosestrife. So Garrowicella beetles are a biocontrol that's began being released, I believe, in the early 1990s in New York State. They are present throughout all of New York State now, and they work by feeding on the leaves, and they make these little holes in leaves that form either a window pane, or some people refer to it as a shotgun splatter pattern. And what happens is that the plant is damaged and it needs to use its resources to kind of regrow and heal that plant, that leaf material, and that prevents it from going to flower. So if you see these patterns of shotgun splatter or window painting on your purple loosestrife plants, we recommend not managing them. If those plants do go to flower, we recommend cutting off the flower spike. However, we want to leave those plants there so these beetles can grow, build their population, and kind of move to adjacent populations. Next species we're going to talk about today is wild parsnip. So wild parsnip is an herbaceous perennial, grows 4 to 6 feet tall, very, very commonly found in disturbed areas, open fields, lawns. You see the species on the right-of-way of roads all the time. Sean talked a little bit about the sap of this species. So the sap of wild parsnip does contain toxic chemicals that can cause burns and blisters when they're exposed to sunlight. So if you get the sap of the species on your skin, you want to take immediate action. The sap is water soluble, so the first thing you want to do is immediately go inside or go to your hose and wash that sap off the best you can. For the sap to cause problems, it does need to be exposed to UV radiation. So after you get that washed off, you want to cover the exposed area, and you want to try to stay inside out of direct sunlight for the next 2 days. I was in a training not long ago for a giant hogweed, and the woman giving the training actually said, if you get the sap on you, wash it off and go spend the next 2 days reading in your closet so you're not exposed to any UV radiation. That actually sounds like a really nice vacation, if you ask me. The leaves of wild parsnip are really, really easily identifiable. So they're compound leaves. It's a stem with multiple leaf, which means it's a stem with multiple leaflets. Each one of those leaflets is going to have sawtoothed edges. And when you see this in the field, this picture almost doesn't do it justice. These leaves look just like celery leaves, overgrown celery leaves. The stem here is pretty non-distinct, but I want to talk about it for a second. So the stem is going to be branched and hollow. And it's hollow, and that's because that's where that sap is contained. So if you just brush up against the plant, you're not going to get the sap on you. You do need to break the plant to get that sap on you. The stem also has slight grooves, as you can see here. The flowers of wild parsnip. Wild parsnip flowers grow in what are known as umbels. So umbels are flower clustered that look like overturned umbrellas. So you can kind of remember that root word that way. Each one of these flower clusters is going to be 2 to 6 inches wide and be made up of multiple flowers, flower cluster. Each one of those little tiny flowers is going to have 5 yellow petals, and they bloom from about June to late August. So they should be starting to bloom probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks here in the Adirondacks. Folks in lower parts of the state are probably already seeing the species in bloom, if not very soon. Like a lot of the other species we talked about today, the species is going to be spread by seeds. So the seeds are small, broad, oval, and they do have a slight rib to them or a slight texture. Again, the native range for this species is going to be Europe and Asia. As you can see on this occurrence map, those really deep, dark areas are where we're seeing a lot of occurrences in the native range. And the impacts, we've already talked about these impacts a lot because it's one that's a human health concern. So it's a little bit scarier to most folks than the environmental concerns. The species does tend to invade disturbed areas such as roadsides. It can also be an agricultural nuisance as it gets into pastures. And it does have that toxic sap that we talked about. And you can see this gentleman's burned arms in the pictures here. What are some lookalikes? The first lookalike I see all the time this time of year is Golden Alexander. So Golden Alexander is going to be a little bit smaller, but it is going to have a very, very similarly covered colored umbella flowers. It does bloom sooner. It is in bloom now. And if you look at that wild parsnip leaf in the middle, you can really see that celery-like leaf. These leaves on Golden Alexander are going to be a lot more delicate, a lot smaller. Another lookalike is cow parsnip. So cow parsnip is kind of the native friend of wild parsnip. They're very, very similar in where they look, how they look, and where they grow. Cow parsnip also does have that toxic sap. If the plant is in flower, you can tell the difference based on the flower. So wild parsnip's going to have white flowers. Wild parsnip's going to have yellow flowers, or cow parsnip's going to have white flowers. If you look at the leaves, they're going to have a slightly different shape. So if you look at the leaves of wild parsnip in the center, it's pretty oblong in shape. Or if you look at the leaves of that cow parsnip near the bottom of that photo, you can see it's more palm shaped or almost more circular in shape. How do we manage wild parsnip? Well, we can dig or pull it if we only have a few plants. In fact, one of our stewards reached out to me today. She's going to go do some wild parsnip management. I told her to wait because it's a rainy day, and if she gets something on her, she's not going to be able to tell if it's rain or wild parsnip. When we do mechanically manage wild parsnip, we want to be sure we're wearing proper PPE. So we do want to have gloves and eye protection on to protect ourselves. You don't need to get the entire root out for wild parsnip. You just need to cut the taproot. So you're going to put your spade or shovel into the ground and just make sure you cut that taproot. Then you want to take that plant material. You're going to put it in your contractor bag, leave it in the sun for a few weeks until it gets soupy or crunchy, and then you can dispose of it at the local landfill. We can also cut or mow the species. The species usually does need to be cut or mowed several times if you are throughout the growing season if you are employing this technique. We never want to mow it in seed. We want to make sure we're above our mower. We're not in the small plants are small. We don't want to mow through wild parsnip that's the same size as us. You know, if you're a transportation professional and you're in a big mower with a cab, obviously there's no sort of splatter to you. But if you're a homeowner on your riding lawnmower, you want to be a little more careful. And we never, ever want to weed whack this species because you will spread that sap around. If you want to see some really horrific photos, Google wild parsnip weed whacker, and you'll see some pictures of gentlemen who were out weed whacking wild parsnip without their shirts on and got sap all over their chests. We want to avoid that at all costs. Chemical treatment is another great approach here, especially if you want to limit your exposure to that toxic sap. We can use a foliar spray treatment type. Labels the law. You can hear me say it a few more times today, believe it or not. Most glyphosate-based products recommend about a 1 to 2% dilution, and most triclopyr products are that same dilution. Again, check your label, see what your label suggests. Another species we're going to talk about today is Japanese stilt grass. So if you're in the Adirondacks, this is a pretty uncommon species here. We consider it a tier 2 species because there are only a few infestations in the region. If you're in other parts of the state, it's very likely that this species is more common. I see Ryan, my partner down in Lower Hudson. You're one of the 4 people I can see, Ryan. So sorry to be calling on you a lot. He's nodding his head. Japanese stilt grass is an annual grass. It sprawls along the ground as it grows. It's really well adapted to low light conditions, which means it can even thrive in the understory of forests. It can do really well in a variety of habitats, including woodlands, wetlands, fields, and roadsides. So this picture here is actually our first infestation of Japanese stilt grass in the Adirondacks. A concerned landowner noticed this growing, knew a little bit about invasive species, and reached out to us. And what we suspect happened here is some construction was happening. A contractor parked their trailer here with some equipment on it. And what was very likely is this equipment was used in an area with Japanese stilt grass prior to being moved to the site. The mud on those tires, like Brad Paisley said, finally dried and fell off, and those seeds fell off with it. And now we have an infestation. Unfortunately, this was at the top of a hill with a ditch, and those seeds moved right down that hill with the water during the rainstorm. Leaves. You're going to look at these leaves and go, okay, Becca, it's a grass. How do I know that this grass is Japanese stilt grass and not something else? Well, the leaves are pale green, narrow, and lance-shaped. Okay, sound like a lot of other leaves. But what they do have is this distinct silvery off-center midrib, and you can see that really, really well in this picture here. The leaf veins are going to be parallel, and the other distinguishing trait here is if you take your fingers and you kind of rub them over the leaf blade, It's going to be smooth in both directions. Most of our native grasses are going to be in rough in one direction or the other. The species also spreads via seeds, which you probably alluded from my story about the first infestation here in the Adirondacks. This plant's going to produce flower spikes late in the summer, so very late August into September here in the Adirondacks. Later, the further north you go, and just tons and tons of tiny little seeds here. Japanese stiltgrass, as you can guess from the name, is native to Asia, so you can see kind of where some native occurrences occur here on this map. And what's the impact of this species? So this is actually a picture from Long Island in Lake George, and you can see it's a very, very extensive mat that's been able to displace the native species in that area. After the plant senesces or dies back from the year, the thatch is really, really slow to decompose, and that creates a really big wildfire hazard, especially up here in the Adirondacks, and I'm imagining down in the Catskills as well. Grasses are notoriously hard to identify. Whitegrass or cutgrass is a native species that's going to look very, very similar to our Japanese stiltgrass. However, it is going to lack that silver midrib that we talked about. Our native grasses can also look very similar. However, as I mentioned, most native grasses are going to have a rough texture. You can kind of feel some slight hairs as you move your fingers back and forth in one direction or the other. And how do we manage Japanese stiltgrass? So we have a lot of mechanical options. We can dig or pull small infestations. We're going to be sure to remove that entire root system, bag it, let it solarize in the sun, and dispose of it. We can also cut or mow it. Again, you may need to do this multiple times in the growing season. You want to monitor it and make sure it's not going to seed. And you never, ever want to mow when it's in seed. If possible, you want to rake up that plant material and bag it and solarize it. For a dense infestation, foliar sprays work great. So we can use, again, the label's below. We want to check the label, a glyphosate-based product, usually at about 1%. Or we can use something like a claim where the rate is actually going to depend on the size of that plant at the time of application. The first infestation in the Adirondacks was a great example of using both of these. So this was on a right of way, but people had planted, their plants and had garden beds up to the road. So we used a foliar spray in areas where it was really dense. And as we got down where it got less dense, we used mechanical. And if it was around someone's flowers, we also used a mechanical treatment. We had really pretty good success that first year. I think we're getting down to our last species, if I remember correctly. And our last species today is going to be swallowwort. So it's a 2-for-1 because there are 2 swallowworts that we're going to talk about. Black and pale swallowworts are herbaceous, perennial, twining vines. They're going to thrive in a lot of habitats, including wetlands, fields, and roadsides. The leaves on this plant are oval, opposite from one another, so you can see they're directly opposite from each other. The leaves have entire margins, so there's no tooth, they're smooth edges. They're really a deep dark green and they're really glossy. Once you've seen a few swallowworts, it really starts to jump out at you because it's such a deep dark green color that a lot of other plants doesn't have, especially vines or herbaceous plants that they're growing amongst. Couple that with the glossiness and it does start to stand out. This is a vine, so the stems twine together as they grow, and they can kind of just create this jumble. One of the common names for swallowwort is dog strangling vine, because it really grows at the height of your dog, and as they try to run through there, they just get caught up in it. So you can kind of think about that. There is a latex that is produced when the stems are broken open. Now, I mentioned this is a 2-for-1, and the vine or stem and the leaves of both of these species look really, really similar. We actually almost need this species to be in flower to be able to tell if it's the pale species or the black species. Both swallowworts are going to have small 5-petaled flowers. Pale swallowwort is on the left. So as you can imagine, it's a more pale color, pale pink in color. And if you look at each one of those petals, the base of the petal is about half the length of the height of the petal. Black swallowwort, on the other hand, has a deep maroon to black color. It's pictured there on the right. And the base of the petal is about the same as the height of the petal. These flowers are going to be present in late May through late June. We've had a lot of really, really cold weather up here in the Adirondacks. So I was actually out doing some surveys and some door knocks for some landowners for the species 2 weeks ago. And the swallowwort was about this tall. I see swallowwort every year, and I had a hard time identifying it because it didn't look like I expected it to when it was that small. So I suspect that we'll be a little late to go to flower on this species this year. The fruit, as Sean mentioned, the species is closely related to milkweed. So it does have these milkweed-like seed pods that are smooth and slender, but they're pointed tips, and they're going to be pretty abundant in late summer. These seed pods surprise me every year. They get on those plants way earlier than I expect. Late summer, these seed pods, or into the fall, these seed pods are going to split open, just like our milkweeds, and they have those downy seeds that are just really, really great at being wind dispersed and spreading themselves around. Swallowwort species are native to Europe, and we can kind of see that distribution on this occurrence map here. And what are the impacts? I believe this picture was actually taken at our the Nature Conservancy's Bocat River Preserve a number of years ago. And I'm happy to note the last 3 years when I went out there, it has been the world's hardest Easter egg hunt, finding the last few swallowworts so that we can eradicate this population entirely. But they can really, really easily overgrow native plants, and they can interfere with forest regeneration as they start to grow up those small seedlings and saplings. It's a really poor forage for deer and other wildlife. And as Sean mentioned, if monarch butterflies do happen to lay their eggs on these swallowwort plants, the sap within the plants is toxic to the monarch butterfly larvae, and they cannot feed and end up starving if they're happening to land on these plants. So what are some lookalikes? All the milkweeds, I have swamp milkweed here, but people see those seed pods and immediately think milkweed. Milkweeds aren't vines, so that's one easy way to tell them a difference. Milkweeds are herbaceous plants. They're also going to have long, thin leaves in general. American hog peanut, I mentioned our site out at the Bocat River. American hog peanut is almost always the one that trips me up because it is a vine. So you kind of see that little trailing vine come out the top. However, the leaves on American hog peanut grow in groups of 3. They aren't as shiny, but a good lookalike, especially earlier in the season, or if you're like me going back and trying to find those last few plants that are mixed in with this native plant. So what are our management options for small infestations? Just a few plants, we can dig or pull them. This species does have a surprisingly long root, so just be mindful of that as you're digging it. We want to remove the entire root system, bag it and solarize. A caution on cutting, this plant does resprout very, very vigorously when it's cut, so you probably want to avoid cutting or mowing as a management technique for this species. For chemical control, we're going to use a foliar spray. Again, label is a law, but generally glyphosate or triclopyr-based products recommended 2% volume-to-volume dilution. And I guess we have one more species. I thought we were at the end, but there is one more for today. And the last species we're going to talk about, I guarantee it's the last one. I can see the slide count. We're getting down there, guys. Is yellow iris. Yellow iris is an herbaceous perennial. It's found on the edges of lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and other wetlands. Its leaves are these broad lance-shaped leaves that are erect and linear, lance-shaped, and they do grow to be about 4 feet tall. The flowers of yellow iris are really pretty. They're these yellow showy flowers. They're going to bloom from April to June, so they should be in bloom in the Adirondacks. I don't know, Sean lives in Saranac Lake. There's some yellow iris around Moody Pond. I don't know if he's noticed this out and about yet. And these flowers are one of the main ways that we can identify yellow iris from its native partner, the blue flag iris. Another thing we can consider is that the height of the flowering stems is going to be similar to the height of the leaves here. The fruits are kind of unique. I think they're pretty cool looking. There are these 3-sided angular seed pods, and they're going to contain 3 rows of seeds that ripen into late summer and fall. I think I like them because they remind me of this candy I had when I was a kid, and I can't remember the name of it. It was like one of those Wonka hard candies, but they came in these little rows just like this. The species does spread via rhizomes and can often be found growing in clusters. These rhizomes, when you break them open, have this pinkish orange color, and when the iris is not in flower, you can use these rhizomes to distinguish yellow iris from blue flag iris. The rhizomes of the yellow iris, as you can see here, are these pinkish or yellow in color, where the blue flag iris rhizomes are going to be more white in color. Yellow iris is native to Europe and Asia, and also Africa, as you can kind of see from this occurrence map here. And its impacts: large colonial populations, just like a lot of the other species we talked about today, those large populations can displace our native species. It's also a poor forage for wildlife. As you can guess, because I've talked about the most common lookalike for our yellow iris is blue flag iris. So it's going to be smaller, but I hate using smaller and bigger as a distinguishing characteristic because it can be hard to tell when you don't have the two plants right next to each other. Blue flag iris is going to have a blue flower, yellow iris has a yellow flower, and also we can use that root indicator that I just talked about. Broadleaf cattail is another lookalike because it does have similar looking leaves. However, the leaves are going to be longer and narrower. They're going to be more of a blue-green in color, and if you look at the base of the leaf is going to be rounded instead of flat. Yellow iris management. So we can do mechanical management. We do at APIP, we actually do a good amount of mechanical management of yellow iris each year. We can dig or pull small infestations. You can see the gentleman here digging it out. Want to be sure to remove that entire root and rhizome system. Bag it, solarize it, just like we talked about for other plants. A word of caution here: for some folks, this plant has sap that can cause skin irritation. It has never happened to me. It has never happened to anyone I know. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen to you. So please be sure to wear gloves and long sleeves if you are managing this species. We also have chemical options here. So we can use a glyphosate-based product. Usually the label for glyphosate is going to recommend a dilution of about 1 to 5%, or triclopire's 3 to 5%. Again, check the specific product you purchase. We can also do a stem injection here where we cut the plant and we're going to inject 0.5 milliliter of glyphosate-based herbicide into each flowering stalk. Again, check your label for how much you're allowed to inject into each plant. So I haven't been watching chat very, very closely as I've been giving this presentation, but I have noticed a few things pop in where people are asking about how to manage different species. So if you want to learn more about species and their identification, remember that's an important part of our IPM strategy. I highly encourage you to check out our website, adkinvasivespecies.com, or any of the other PRISM's websites, especially if you're calling in from a different region. We all see different things and we all manage different things. So there's a lot of information out there for you to read. One of the few great things that came out of COVID is we've switched from our in-person trainings to these virtual trainings. And all of these virtual trainings are recorded. So we are building a really great library on our YouTube page of all these recordings. You can also access that YouTube page through our ADK Invasives webpage. This is, I believe, the 3rd or 4th time we've offered a backyard invasives training. So some of the front material is pretty similar, but we always focus on a different subset of species. We often give this at different times of year. A lot of the species I talked today are best managed in spring. Last time we gave it was late fall, so we talked about a lot of woody shrub species that are great to manage in fall. If you want to learn to control a particular species, I highly encourage you to check out APIP's Best Management Practices Guide. So we have a really great guide. It breaks species down by functional type. So do you have a grass? Do you have a tree? Do you have a shrub? And it walks you through the best way to manage those species based on the size and gives you recommendations. Once you look at those general recommendations, you buy your product, you can look and see what the dilution rate is. There are also a ton of other great resources available on our ADK Invasive Species website under the resource tab. Sean already dropped the FILG best management practice into the chat, but say you're managing an invasive species and you want to plant native, we have lists of native plant nurseries and native seed sources in the areas. There's a lot of great resources on that webpage, so I highly encourage you to check that out. Last but not least, before we leave here today, I want to talk about IMAP invasives. So I highly encourage you to report any invasive species that you find. These observations come to folks like myself and Ryan, I believe Brittany's on here too, and maybe a few other terrestrial coordinators from other regions of the state, as well as DOT staff, and the staff at IMAP, and we'll actually go in and confirm your records. But what's really cool is it helps us terrestrial coordinators know where folks are finding these. It helps us get a better extent of the distribution of these species across our region. And if you find a high priority species, you may get a call from one of us asking if we can come assist you with management to get rid of that species. The IMAP Invasives app is really, really easy to use. So you're going to sign up on their webpage. Sean can include some information in our follow-up email, which again, folks, the follow-up for this email will come on Friday. Immediately after today's call, we're going to send out a link for the pesticide applicators to take their quiz. And once that quiz closes at 1 p.m. on Friday, Sean will send out the link to this recording and this information for IMAP. Once you create your IMAP account, you download the app onto your phone, and it's really, really easy to use. You open the app and you see this first screen here. You're going to click that add observation button, and then you're going to take a photo with your phone of what that species looks like. Sean's actually giving a great webinar 2 Fridays from now, I believe, on how to take a good IMAP picture or just take a good picture in general. You pick your species, select if you found that species or not. Sometimes those non-detections are just as valuable about it as those detections. You can give us your date. When you get home, you're going to upload that record from your phone, and then folks out there will confirm it and use that information to make our management decisions throughout the region. If you want to learn more about IMAP Invasives, I highly encourage you to visit their website. They have tons and tons and tons of great training resources. And back in 2020, they actually gave us a specific workshop for APIP folks, and you can find that on our recorded resources library, which I already talked about. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sean for a second.
Hey everyone. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about APIP Summer Webinar Series. Becca, I think maybe if you click it or something, there should be, yeah, there we go. All right, so we have a bunch of really cool webinars coming up this summer. They're all free. Most of them are online. Coming up on June 9th. That's a Friday, so New York Invasive Species Awareness Week begins that Sunday before June 9th. We're going to have an Invasive Species Awareness Week guided walk, which Becca is going to take part in. That's going to be down the Lake George region, and that's from 10 to 11 a.m. And then Photography for Nature Lovers is going to be online, and that one is the one that Becca just talked about. It's going to be hosted by me. I'm really excited for it. If you're interested in learning more about photography, even if it's just, you just want to build up your knowledge on how to use the manual settings on a camera and take better photos of your kids on vacation, this is a great workshop for that. But we're also going to tie it into how to take photos for plant identification purposes. So you're going to learn a lot of photography basics like f-stop and ISO and shutter speed, proper composition. But then we're also going to talk about what you should be looking at when you photograph a plant, so somebody on the other end can identify it. The purple loosestrife is a great example of that, where the lookalike had, I think Becca said 4 leaves, but purple loosestrife has 5 to 7. So you want to make sure you photograph those flower petals so people can see and count and know what you're photographing. So on June 21st, we have the Lake Protectors virtual training. If you have a lake that you want to help monitor for invasive species, this is a great training for you. That's from 9 to 11:30 a.m. And there will be 2 in-person Lake Protectors trainings as well. Those are being confirmed right now, but there will be one in July and one in August. Then on July 20th, we have Best Management Practices for Roadside Invasive Species. On August 2nd, we have our Forest Pest Hunters surveying for beech leaf disease. Beech leaf disease is new to the Adirondacks, so that's a really important one. We train folks how to look for beech leaf disease, and they can agree to adopt a trail and survey it. All right, next up. Oh, and you should go to our, if you click it again back there, our URL should be on there. Yeah, so to learn more, register for any of these events, go to adkinvasives.com/events.
And before I move to the next slide, I just want to add that BMPs for roadside invasives on July 20th. I know we have a lot of applicators today seeking credits. There will also be credits offered for that. I believe it is 1.5 credits in categories 3A, 6A, 9, and 10 for that one. So if you're interested in some more credits, feel free to join us back that day.
Cool, thanks for that, Becca. All right, next slide. All right, so we do have a number of outreach materials. I have the URL in the chat. I just put it in there. They're all free. They cover a wide range of topics. The brochures, which are at the top three on the right there, protect your forests, waters, and then protect Adirondack trees. Those go into a little bit more detail, especially the forests and the waters. They actually have some species highlighted in them, and then some best practices for like clean, drain, dry, and don't move firewood, things like that. And then we have the posters down below, which are basically poster versions of the brochures, but they don't highlight any invasive species. And then to the right there, you'll see the Field Guide to Terrestrial Invasive Species of the Adirondacks. I mentioned that in the chat earlier. This is a free guide. It's, I believe it's 28 terrestrial invasive species, and it was basically a redo of some older ones that we had. Becca and I worked really hard on it. We're really happy with how this guide came out, and it is free. You can download it. If you go to that URL there, the adkinvasives.com/order, you can also order print versions and we will mail them to you for free. There is a limit of 10 on the guide, but the other items do not have a limit to how many you can order. So I definitely encourage you to check them out. And especially that guide, I think it's really handy to have in your backpack or your back pocket as you're, going about your hikes or hanging out in your yard or whatever.
So as we mentioned, and as I'm sure everyone knows, today's course has been offered for 1.5 pesticide credits in categories 3A, 6A, and 9. So to receive credits, you must have been with us for this entire webinar. I know there are folks joining us from conference rooms, so don't worry about that. And you do need to complete a 10-question questionnaire within 2 business days. It may take us a few moments after we wrap up today to send out that link, so that quiz will be open until 1 p.m. on Friday, and then it will close. Unlimited attempts are allowed to get that passing score of 70. Please, please, please double check your mailing address when you put your mailing address into that quiz, because that's where we're going to mail your certificate to. Sean has just dropped the link to that quiz in chat, so feel free to copy that into your URL now. You do need to stay with us for the next 10 minutes for a Q&A, but after that, you're welcome to go take the quiz. And as I said, if you don't copy and paste it now, Sean will be sending an email with a link after we wrap up. So without further ado, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have a pretty big crowd, and that's always great to see. I don't want to take any questions. I do want to note that if you have a species-specific question, or you have a question specifically about something that you're encountering on your property, let's keep those questions to the end, because those questions, the answer is often it depends, and we're going to need to drill into something. So we'll take some of the more general questions first that are going to be more relevant to most folks, and then folks can start to log off as we answer those more specific questions. So Sean, do we have any questions in chat here?
We do, and actually I'm going to start off with a question I have. When you talked about purple loosestrife and the lookalikes, purple loosestrife has a square stem, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do the lookalikes have a square stem?
Well, that's a good question. I don't believe blue vervain does. And I also don't believe fireweed does. I think fireweed sometimes can, if I remember correctly. There are also a lot of plants in the mint family that can have a square stem. So you want to start looking at those leaves if you're not in flower yet.
So I have a question here from Catherine. Can you describe what you mean by solarize?
Yeah, so when I say solarize, we're going to put a plant in a contractor bag. We're going to leave it in the sun. So what happens when we put things in a bag in the sun is the greenhouse effect happens, and it gets really, really hot and kind of cooks it. And that's what we mean by solarize. It can take, anywhere from about 2 to 4 weeks. I find here in the Adirondacks, it tends to take a little bit on the longer end just because we tend to have cooler nights. And you just want to check those bags every, I check mine once a week for our pro crew. And once they either get really soupy and gross or really, really brittle, that plant material is not going to be viable anymore. And that's a perfect time to dispose of it in our trash system. So essentially, we're putting that plant material into a bag so it can't escape, and we're cooking it.
Here's a question that was in the chat, and somebody did respond, but I just want to see if you have anything to add, Becca. It's how do you tell the difference between poison ivy and swallowwort?
Oh, that's a great question. So poison ivy is usually going to have those leaves of 3. A swallowwort can be deceiving, where it sometimes looks like it has leaves of 3 because it does have a terminal leaf on it. So you're going to kind of want to look, and are those groups of leaves coming off in groups of 3 or the groups of 1? And if someone had something else in chat, I'd love to hear it.
It says poison ivy has leaves in groups of 3 and they are lobed, and swallowwort has opposite leaves of 2 with no lobes.
Perfect.
Cool. And let's see, I think we definitely have some species specific questions here. And what is a good resource for identifying invasive plants? I think you already sort of covered that. And I put a couple links in the chat as well.
Perfect. We're welcome to start jumping into some of the species specific questions that folks want. And full disclosure here, I may just say it depends. My email address is right here on the screen, and let's chat offline a little bit.
All right, we have, this is one I've asked many times. What is the best way to herbicide gout weed? I have that all over my property, so I feel you if you're dealing with it.
Yeah, so just a foliar spray is probably going to be your best application method. It's not a species that we here at APIP manage, so I don't know what the recommended dilution rate is off the top of my head. So I do recommend, maybe doing a little Googling, or if you have questions, email me after, and I'm happy to do a little bit of quote unquote professional Googling and give you some more specific management advice for that species.
Do you know what the best timing is to spray goutweed?
I'm going to assume, man, that's a good question. It doesn't really, it goes to flower, right?
It does, yeah, and I believe it's usually a little bit later in the summer.
Yeah, so I'd recommend just before, in general, most things are right before flower, so I'd say right before flower. If you have that in your yard and you're kind of observing it, you kind of know the phenology of that species. And if someone has a better answer than me, please speak up. I know some of the prisms may or may not manage the species.
Yeah, it's a tough one. What is the best way to eradicate mugwort?
I like hand pulling mugwort. I often see it kind of at the edge of parking lots is where I mostly see it. Those are usually like loose sandy soil, so I pull it. Again, if it's going to be a big infestation, you're going to want to probably go with an herbicide with a foliar spray. Mugwort is an agricultural nuisance. A lot of times these agricultural nuisance plants have developed some degree of herbicide resistance, however, so you may want to drill into that. It may not be a glyphosate-based product that might be your best option, so a little bit of research there will go a long way.
All right, and what is the best way to eradicate wild parsnip?
So we talked about wild parsnip. So wild parsnip, great to dig or pull. Of course, you're wearing proper PPE, and if not, a foliar spray. I believe the seed bank time for wild parsnip is about 7 years, so be prepared for it to come back for a while.
Oh. And the last one here is, what is the best way to eradicate Vinca, V-I-N-C-A?
Yeah, so Vinca.
Vinca.
Again, just like on all the other species I talked about, small infestation, hand pull it, throw it in those contractor bags and let it rot. Vinca does go to flower pretty early. I think we're probably even past flower here already in the Adirondacks. So if you do use an herbicide, I'd recommend doing that earlier in the season.
And we just had a new one come in, bindweed.
I've had really good luck hand pulling bindweed. Yeah, it's big and weedy and tangly, but I've had really good luck. There's often fewer roots there than you think.
Right, that's all the questions I have in my notes. If I missed you, please speak up. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free. You could go off mute and ask, or you can put it in the chat if you'd rather I read it.
And I'm going to give Ryan a thank you for answering some questions in chat and putting some additional information in chat as I talk through things. That's always appreciated.
You're welcome.
Well, folks, if we don't have any more questions, I want to once again thank everyone for joining us. And just a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be a little bit delayed just to give folks taking that quiz for their credits a bit of time to take that quiz. If you have any follow-up questions, my email address is on the screen right now. Please do not hesitate to reach out. Like I said, a lot of the time the answer is it depends. And I'd rather, instead of giving you a more general answer on today's webinar, talk with you about what you're seeing and what your best option is for what you're seeing out there. So thank you.
We did have a quick question from Catherine. Will the slides be available to attendees? As Becca's mentioned, we do put the webinar recording will be on YouTube as of Friday afternoon. And so the entire slideshow will be there. Do we ever put the slideshow on the website?
We don't, but if someone does want slides, just feel free to reach out to me and I can send you a PDF of the slides for your reference. If you wanted certain slides to use professionally, reach out to me and we can chat about that as well.
Thanks everyone for coming today. If there's no more questions, we'll say goodbye. All right. Bye.